Everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I thought it would be fun to break out my favorite palettes for the spring season. I'm actually filming this still in winter, but I am very much looking forward to spring. And I feel like recently I haven't been doing as many creative eyeshadow looks. And so I wanted to bring out these palettes both to inspire myself and encourage myself to use them. And also for any of you who have these palettes, hopefully this is a helpful reminder. And if you don't have these palettes, maybe some of these will end up on your wish list. But if you are as excited about spring as I am, then just stick around. So before we dive into the palettes, let me just go over for me what a spring palette is. So there's kind of two major categories, I would say, of looks that I really associate with the spring. So first and foremost, there's pastel eyeshadows. There's really no other season where I immediately gravitate to and think of pastels the way I do during the spring. And given that that's a type of makeup I really like, I really enjoy leveraging the spring season to go into those looks because I feel like between Easter and all of the flowers in bloom, it's really a lovely time to pick these sorts of colorful pastel shades. The second category I tend to gravitate to is sort of soft romantic looks. So this is maybe kind of coming a little bit from Valentine's Day, but also again with the flower vibes of spring. So I really like going in with looks that have some color, but are still overall romantic. So maybe more roses, more golds, those sorts of shades. Of course, no one should be constrained based on the season in terms of what eyeshadows to wear, but you'll notice those sorts of themes in the palettes that I share today. So first off, let's actually start with what I have on my eyes today. I'm actually quite proud of this look. I think it's really, really pretty. Let me actually bring you guys in for a close-up just so you can see it a bit more clearly. Basically, I have some pastel mattes in the crease, I have some shimmers in the center, and then a green eyeshadow as liner today. So I used two palettes to achieve today's look. First is the Natasha Denona Pastel palette. And this is definitely the one palette in my collection I think most screams spring. And unfortunately, I don't get much use out of it the rest of the year. So this is definitely one I'm going to be breaking out for the spring season. So it's not the most versatile palette in that it is just pure pastel. There really aren't any deepening shades in this palette, but it is super, super fun in the springtime. I mean, doesn't this palette look exactly like a bunch of Easter eggs? It's just that exact color story. So for today's look, I started out with Feather, and that's what I have sort of all over my crease as a transition shade. I went in with Tulle in the outer corner just to intensify the pink a bit. And then in the inner third, I went in with Bellini to add a little bit of that peachiness. And then I did the same thing on my lower lash line. For me, this palette really stands out, especially in terms of the pastel mattes. If you are someone who's on the market for a good pastel matte formula, this basically is all you really need in your collection. For context, I think pastel mattes are pretty hard to formulate. They tend to be pretty chalky because in order to make it pastel, you need sort of a thick white base in the pigment to ensure that actually shows up as pastel on your eyes. As a result, a lot of the formulations on the market are very crumbly and there tends to be a lot of kick up in pan. I wouldn't say the formula in this palette is perfect by any means, but it is really good compared to other formulations I've tried. I feel like the shades do stand out on the lids as pastel and are still really easy to work with. So you're not going to get a ton of issues with fallout or crumbling or anything like that. And I really like how this palette has a variety of different ways you can go in. Now it looks a little intimidating because it's so colorful, but as you guys can see from today's look, if I just left out the green eyeshadow, this would just be a very, very soft, simple, romantic look that has those sorts of pinks and peaches in it. So you can definitely make this work on more of an everyday basis as well. Now, of course, there are shimmers in this palette as well. Those are quite pretty, but honestly, I don't feel like the shimmers in this palette really stand out a lot. So I do use them on occasion, but this is a palette where I do prefer to go in with the mattes and kind of like I did today, use some of my other palettes for shimmers. Moving right along, the other palette I used in today's look was my Pat McGrath Sublime palette. This is Mothership 2, really pretty for the spring. I feel like, again, this is the perfect sort of balance of that kind of romantic look with a little bit of color as well. So for today's look, I went in with this shade kind of on the lid, and then I covered that up with this golden shade. So where you see Twinkle, that's totally from this shade over here. In the inner corner, I used a mix of this shade and this shade over here. And then I used this one as liner. And I did use my Pat McGrath Intensifies eye wand when going in with this shade. So basically I took a smudger brush, brushed it on that wand, and then brushed it in here, just so I could get a lot of precision without fallout. And I'm really pleased with how all of these shadows performed in today's look. So usually this shade is a little bit crumbly, but if you just use it with a finger, it gives you that sort of scattered gold effect, which I think is really pretty. And then this one worked super well as liner coupled with the wand. This is of Pat McGrath's palettes one that I use less often. So if you guys have watched any of my previous Pat McGrath Mothership rankings videos, this does tend to fall low in the pack. That said, every spring I think about this palette because it just is that perfect color story for the spring. The reason this tends to not be higher in my list of Pat McGrath palettes is just that I find that this color story over here is kind of boring, so I don't really gravitate to it a lot. And then in terms of the 4 special shades, this one, like I said, is a little bit tricky to work with. And then I don't actually go into emerald green that often. And these two have analogs in other palettes. So this one is in another palette as well. And there's a very similar one to this in Subversive. And so on the whole, this is not one of my top Pat McGrath palettes, but definitely a palette that I think is really lovely for the springtime. And indeed, even this like slightly boring color story over here, I feel like is really lovely for spring. This rose and this peach just really give me spring vibes. And then I think you can definitely spice it up with the shades over here. And as a side note, recently I've been going through all of my Pat McGrath palettes again and doing looks with them, and I will probably do an updated rankings video at some point, so definitely let me know if you guys are interested in that. For context, I already have 2 rankings videos from the past couple years, but I do like to periodically update those because I love my Pat McGrath Motherships so much, and I've been having a lot of fun breaking them out again. So speaking of Mothership palettes, another one that I love for the spring is Huetopian Dream. So I think of this as being like my Sailor Moon palette. It's that kind of really pretty color story that has you covered in terms of pinks, corals, lavenders, and purples. So this is sort of more on the romantic side, I would say, of the spring color story. This is a super fun palette to play around with. It looks pretty monochrome and pan, especially if you only focus on these shades. But these special effects shades have a lot of oomph to them. So this one has kind of a green to bronze to pinky red shift to it. This one's more of a pure gold, similar to what we saw in Sublime, though this one's a little easier to work with. It's less flaky. And then these two are super fun. So this one has a lavender, pink, gold, and even slightly greenish flip to it, whereas this one has a purple to blue to pink flip to it. So if you combine these with these over here, then you will be able to get a more colorful look. And in general, I think this is really great if you like those special effects from Pat McGrath. This is a very layerable palette. You have a multi-chrome, you have these astral shades, and then you have these more straightforward metallics and mattes. And the quality in this palette is really impeccable. This was, I think, the last time she had her baked astral shades in her Motherships. Since then, she's just been using her pressed formula, which is nice, but honestly, I'm still a huge fan of these baked shades. So on the whole, I really love this palette, would highly recommend it, and I'm super excited to dip into this. Like, especially this coral shade right now is really calling my name. I feel like this is perfect for spring. I feel like if you just go into this, use this all over the lids, and then top it with some of these, that would be just such a fun spring look. Next, let's go back into Natasha Denona. Here we have her Triochrome palette. So when I think of pastel, colorful palettes, this is one that definitely comes to mind. So this is a lot grungier than the pastel palette. All of these shades kind of have more of a gray base to them than a white base. But as you can see, they're still very spring-like, very light and happy. And so I feel like this is also a really lovely palette for the season. In particular, I find for myself in the spring, I often do gravitate to these sorts of peachy shades. So I feel like this look on the bottom is very natural for that. But you also have this really fun sort of vibrant green row as well. And then if you want to go more of that romantic route, you have this purple row. When I first got this palette, I was kind of on the fence about it because the Triochrome shades in the middle are kind of boring. They're not super impactful on the lids. But since then, I've really fallen in love with this palette because of the mattes. The matte formulation here is just super, super easy to use. These shadows really show up very well on the lids. Even though they might look a little bit on the lighter side in pan, they build up super well on the eyes. And they're just such unique shades. I feel like I haven't seen from any other brand these sorts of matte shades. And so I love going into this palette and then dipping out into one of my other palettes for the shimmers to add a bit more gleam to the eyes. But if you are someone who likes more of a satin multi-chrome, these are also good for that. But I'm super excited to pull this out for the spring season and introduce a bit more color into my looks. Speaking of color, next we have the Natasha Denona Circo Loco palette. So this is definitely going kind of beyond the pastel realm in that this is a hyper saturated palette. I kind of debated whether to put this in this roundup because I don't really know that there's a specific season this matches with. The color story kind of gives me winter vibes because it's overall sort of more cool toned with the blues and the purples. But in practice in winter, I find that I'm not necessarily going for such vibrant looks. So I put this in the spring roundup just because I feel like it does have these sort of pastel shades over here. And spring in general, I think is just a fun time to play with color. And so if you saw the previous palettes I showed you and you felt like they were too muted or a little bit boring, and you want something that really screams out color, then this palette definitely has you covered. So the quality in this palette is really impeccable. I find the shadows work really perfectly. Unlike in Triochrome, the shimmers in this palette are higher impact, and so that is something that I do like about this. I still do often though dip out of this palette and go into other palettes when I'm using this just because this color story is very in your face. But if you go into this palette just for a few shades and dip out for some other shades, you can definitely tone this down quite a bit. As a side note, I actually purchased these two palettes together in a bundle. I think if you can find that sort of deal on Natasha Denona's website, that is the best way to get them because they are quite splurgy on their own, especially if you're not someone who frequently goes in with very colorful looks. But I do really love these in my collection just because I have so many different palettes, but these two are super unique. There's really nothing else I have similar to this. And so when I am trying to go in with more color, there's kind of no way to beat these. And as a side note, actually, this really matches my dress today. Maybe I should have actually used this palette instead of the other ones. Like, wow, look at that match. And by the way, if you are curious about any of these palettes, I think I have dedicated videos to pretty much all of them, or at least have showcased these in videos in the past. So definitely feel free to search for those videos if you want to see me actually swatching and using these palettes on my eyes. For today's video, since I knew it was going to be very chatty, I didn't want to include all of that because then it would take too long, but definitely feel free to check out my other videos. So I have a few more Natasha Denona palettes to talk about. So the next one is the Natasha Denona Retro Glam palette. This, kind of similar to Circo Loco, was one I wasn't quite sure about in terms of whether to put it with spring. I feel like it also gives me some wintry vibes just because it's overall quite a cool toned palette. That said, one color story I do really like in this spring is kind of a green color story, and this one definitely has you covered with that. There are some pinks and reds in this as well. I find that when I use those, I still like to use green all over the lid. And as a result, I don't really use this red shade that often. But if you are someone who likes sage green, who likes khaki shades, I think this is the perfect palette. The quality is really impeccable here. None of the shimmers really stand out. These are all just kind of in her normal metallic formulas. But you can get a really beautiful soft look with this. And similar to the other palettes I mentioned, if you're just here for the mattes as well, the mattes do not disappoint. This is really great for setting up a look. But overall, I find this is a really fun, chic color story. I feel like the sage green and khaki is a good way to integrate color into a look, especially color that sort of reminds you of spring and all of the plants in bloom, without it being super in your face. Like, this will not give you a look where you feel like, wow, there's a lot of color, but it will give you those spring vibes in an elegant way. Now, a palette I definitely strongly associate with spring is the Natasha Denona Mini Retro palette, which is technically what the previous palette was inspired by. But you can see here, this palette is a lot more warm toned, which is why I tend to think of this as spring. Basically, I would say the Midi palette has a little bit more of a blue undertone to it, whereas the Mini palette has much more of a peach undertone. I'm really excited to play around with this palette because I haven't for a while, but this is definitely one of my favorite mini palettes from Natasha Denona. So these mattes over here are really fun, really versatile, and then these two shimmers really stand out. So I've mentioned being less impressed with some of Natasha Denona's shimmers, but these two over here really pack a punch. Whenever I use them, I don't feel like I need any glitter toppers or anything else to add glitz and glam. These really stand very well on their own, but you still have the versatility in this palette of this shade over here. So if you wanted something super soft, you could just use these three shades. But if you want something that really has that sort of molten metallic look, then these two have you covered. This is also just a really fun, unique color story in that Natasha Denona is one of those few brands that actually bridges the kind of red and green spectrum. Those are sort of hard colors to put together, but if you pick the right tones, I feel like it really works. So in this case, having those sorts of peachy pinks and then having this really olivey khaki green shade actually manages to work really well together on the lids. And for me, that's a combination I really like for spring. Kind of like in today's look where I have the green and the pink. It's just that sort of high contrast, but if you can do it in a more low-key way, it comes across as colorful and interesting, but not too overwhelming. And so I really can't wait to play around with this guy. The last Natasha Denona palette I have is this Mini Love Story, which she released for Valentine's Day a couple years back. I'm going to keep this one short because I don't actually know if she still sells this, and also Valentine's Day is technically not in spring, but I don't know, I always kind of associate them together. Like once Valentine's Day passes by, I feel like spring is just right around the corner. And this is definitely a palette I don't really think of outside of Valentine's Day. It's not really a color story I go for that often. But if you do want that sort of romantic look, I think this is perfect. This palette has nice range in that you can get a complete look from it. It has this really light shade, which is perfect for inner corner and brow bone highlight or all over the lid. And then you have this really deep shade over here, this nice transition shade, this jewel chrome shade, and this metallic. And so you can actually get a decent number of looks from this. They will all, of course, give you that strong Valentine's vibe. But I think this is a nice combination of the romantic spring that I was talking about with also the colorful spring. So if you have this in your collection, consider this your reminder to break it out for the season. So with Natasha Denona out of the way, let's get back into Pat McGrath. So I have two additional palettes to talk about here. First, we have Ritualistic Rose. This is one that I think is really lovely for a simple romantic spring look. You have pink, gold, fuchsia, lavender, and bronze. Now, this palette by itself doesn't necessarily give you a complete look if you want something smoky, but I think it's really nice for the springtime when, at least for me, I tend to go for lighter looks as part of this whole pastel thing. Like even with today's look, you can see for once I did not actually deepen up my outer corner. And for me, that's something I normally do, except in these very spring-like looks. So with this palette, you are getting 4 shimmers. So technically this could be used in the outer corner, but it's not going to really deepen things up. This palette is very fun though. It's 4 of her Blitz Astral baked shades, which, as I mentioned earlier, she isn't really producing anymore. So this is a very special formulation from her. None of these are extremely glittery shades, so it's not like any of these are toppers, but they're all really beautifully smooth on the lids and definitely pack some shine. This one over here in particular is a dual chrome. It has a really pretty pink to gold flip. Now, do you need this palette if you have all of her motherships? Definitely not. These are very common shades in her motherships as well. But I do enjoy this curation and find it just great for a very simple, pretty spring look. Next, we have Fleur Fantasia. So definitely, of all of my Pat McGrath palettes, this is the one that I think most screams spring. And this one also actually really matches my dress today. So I actually rarely use this palette, and I tend to rank this pretty low among my Pat McGrath palettes. So this is not one that I would say run out and buy if you don't already have it in your collection. There's nothing wrong with this palette per se, but basically, A, there aren't any of her Astral shades in this, so these are all just pressed shades. And B, the one matte in here is not super pigmented, so I'd say compared to the peachy pastel mattes in the Natasha Denona palettes, this one doesn't quite pack as much of a punch. It doesn't have as much of that white base to it that helps it stand out on your lids. On the plus side, that means this is easier to use to some extent, so it's not going to be as crumbly as some of the other pastel formulations. But on my skin tone at least, this just barely stands out as a result. And then these 2 shades over here are also quite sheer, so the look you're going to normally get is going to be quite light with this. This one shade over here, which is a little bit dual chromatic, is the only one that packs any sort of punch, but I feel like matched with the other shades, because it has so much more texture, it doesn't necessarily blend very seamlessly in with them. So personally, I feel like I don't really love the look I get when I just use these 4 together, but none of these are so outstanding that I pick up this palette just for that. That said though, it is a really pretty color story that definitely matches for spring. So if you do have this in your collection, I would suggest taking it out, and I'll probably give this an extra shot as well. So last but certainly not least, we have one palette from Viseart. This is the Paris Edit. And Viseart is a brand I haven't talked about on my channel for so incredibly long, which is kind of sad because I actually really love Viseart. It's one of my favorite eyeshadow brands, and I think value-wise is probably one of the best values on the market. This palette in particular is one that I used to love so much. I used to wear this almost every single day. I haven't actually broken this out for a while now. And so when I was thinking about this video, I thought this would be a really great opportunity to whip this out again and remind myself, since this is the perfect color story if you do want that kind of soft, romantic spring look. There's so many different directions you can go in with this. It has your sort of pinky shades, your purpley mauvey shades, your more neutral shades as well. And the formulations here are just impeccable. Viseart definitely has one of the best matte formulations on the market. They just blend so easily and build up so easily. So I highly recommend them for their mattes. There are a bunch of other formulations though in this, depending on which direction you want to go. So this column over here is basically satin shimmers. This one's also a satin. This one's a metallic. This one's basically a matte with some glimmers in it. And then this one and this one are sort of your higher shine shades. So Viseart's not going to give you as much impact as like a Pat McGrath palette. In general, their shimmers are going to run a little bit more on the natural satin side. But I do really like this palette and like the versatility of it. I do think this shade especially actually looks really beautifully wet and shiny on the lids. And so especially if you're going for that softer spring look, I think this is so perfect and so compact. It's amazing that you have 12 shades in this one little package, and it's quite affordable as well. So if you haven't tried out Viseart and you are on the market for a spring palette, this one is a really great option, and I'm really excited to play around with this again because I feel like Viseart is less popular nowadays than a lot of these other brands, and so I tend to think about it less, and especially for videos, I often forget to bring out my Viseart palettes, but they are just such good quality and so easy to use, and there's so many different shades you can get because each of their palettes come with so many options. So that's it in terms of my spring palette roundup. Hopefully this video was helpful for any of you who wanted some inspiration for possible eyeshadow looks in the upcoming season. I would love to hear in the comments what palettes you guys like for spring, or what kinds of color stories to you scream spring. Let me know if you have any favorites. And if you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.